Now let's look at how the Soviet Union was thinking about the same question, that is the third world, colonialism in the third world, the question of development, and the question obviously for the Soviet Union of how communism as a movement was going to engage with the governments and people of the third world. I think you already know the basics that Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known in the world by his code name, his underground name, Lenin, created a party in Russia for the purpose of a proletarian revolution. The idea of Marxism, of course, is very central, very much inspired by, very much taken from, or a continuity of, the ideas of the Enlightenment. Marxism, of course, rests on the idea that there can be a social science. We can examine things scientifically, study things scientifically, and devise scientific solutions for them. It's not a religious ideology in that sense at all. And so now the new idea also began to develop in the Soviet Union that the fundamental methodology of Marxism could be applied to the third world to create solutions that would result in the development of the third world, of Asia, Africa, and other parts. So this was, in other words, an alternative form of modernity. We're not going to go the American way. We're not going to do what Europe did. What Europe did was pretty horrible, actually, because they had a colonial empire. And most of the people in the third world were against that colonial empire, didn't want to be ruled by Britain and France, etc. तो बड़ी exploitative किस्म की powers थी. तो third world के अंदर लोगों की ख्वाहिश after the Second World War तो irrepressible थी कि हमने आज़ाद होना है. उससे पहले भी जारी थी, World War I से पहले भी जारी थी, उससे भी पहले जारी थी. हमने भी War of Independence की 1857 में. So an alternative form of modernity was posited by the Soviet Union. Now, the form of modernity that the Americans were bringing in was tainted a little bit because they were very close, they were seen as a European power. And the experience with other European powers, France and Britain, was not, Germany, was pretty horrible. But on the other hand, they were also seen as being the most advanced economy in the world. Their consumer goods were fantastic. Their technology was fantastic. So this was a contestation now between the Soviet Union, an alternative form of modernity, although not the leading power in the world, but a very powerful state nonetheless, giving an alternative path to the modernization of the societies, and the United States of America. For the communists themselves, they saw their ideas as a higher stage of modernity. It's not that they rejected modernity, they just saw liberalism and everything that came before it as being good but for that period. And now Marxism was the next stage in its development. And they felt that since the revolution had been made in Russia first, that Russian proletariats, workers, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union had a special role to play in the liberation of the third world. Now Russia itself, before communism, had a long imperial past. Much like other European powers, Russia was also an imperial power. They had begun to expand from the 16th century onwards. And by the 18th century, they were in high gear in the time of Peter the Great, who was himself actually a great reformer, very brutal, but also a great reformer. It's after him that the city of St. Petersburg is named. By the end of the 19th century, less than half the empire's subjects were ethnic Russians. Around 2/3 only were ethnic Slavs. Slavs is a larger category. Russians are one kind of Slavs. And in fact, by this time, there were now around 70 major ethnic groups within the state called Russia. It was incredibly diverse, one of the most diverse empires you can imagine. And the difference between the British Empire and the Russian Empire was that the Russian Empire was contiguous. It was one territory. British Empire, you have Britain over here as an island, and then you have India over there, right? It's very, very far apart. But the Russian state is one contiguous territory. Right from Europe all the way to the borders of Korea, they had this huge, massive state. The way that the traditional Russians of the Tsarist period saw their mission was that they were on the frontiers of civilization, and beyond civilization there lay chaos and anarchy. A state must decide either to give up this constant task of creating civilization and give its outer borders over to chaos, or to penetrate ever further into the wild countries. This is the foreign minister in 1864 speaking. So they saw themselves also as bringing civilization to other societies. And the way in which they were bringing the civilization was called Russification, making them more Russian, teaching them to speak Russian, to adopt Russian culture. Russia's war in Asia in the mid-19th century became so brutal that they were genocidal. They were absolutely horrific. And it was largely the same with respect to their actions in Europe. This is a poster of Finland trying to protect itself against the Russification or Russification campaign of the Tsars, which is attacking it. In the Caucasus, large numbers of Muslim non-combatants were killed, driven into exile. Their fields were taken over by Slav migrants. They were thrown off from the best lands. It was pretty horrific. They continued to fight on, though, but it was a very difficult war for them, because these societies in which Central Asian Muslims lived were generally not industrial societies. In fact, most of them were even pre-agricultural. They were nomadic, tribal side of societies. To resist such a big empire was a very difficult task. Within Russia, there were two different trends in the intelligentsia. One trend is called the Slavophiles, and the other were called the Westernizers. Those who looked to Russian history thought that what Russia really needs is to dig into its own roots and go into its orthodox Greek Christianity, its monarchy, its own traditions, but in a very reactionary way. We don't need science. We don't need enlightenment. We don't need any of these things. We have our own culture and history. The issue with Russia was that Russia was considered the gendarme of Europe. It was the bulk of counter-revolution in Europe. Any place in Europe where there was a revolution for enlightenment, against the monarchy, against the church, or any of these revolutions, who was the first person in those countries that would go and destroy that revolution? It was always the Russian army. They were the ultra-orthodox people of Europe. Today they have the exact opposite image. You know, in the Soviet period they had the image of being atheists and so on. Before that they were the total opposite of that. They were the most conservative of all the European states. So the Westernizers, on the other hand, were the Marxists. They thought that Tsarism was horrific. The whole structure of the Greek Orthodox Church was basically feudal. All has to be done away with. Lenin, for example, writes that capitalism would be a really good thing in Russia. We are just half feudal. The market and capitalism is converting, he wrote, Asiatic forms of labor with their infinitely developed bondage and diverse forms of personal dependence into European forms of labor. It's bringing about an industrial revolution. The European manner of thought and feeling is no less necessary for the effective utilization of machines than steam, coal, techniques. We have to learn the European way of life. That's more advanced, that's capitalist, that's industrial. We are pre-industrial, we are feudal. We have to do away with all of this. So the Marxists of Russia were against this whole idea of Slavophile thinking and Russification. In fact, Lenin wrote that the Russians had converted the 70 nationalities that they had taken over into a prison, I quote, a prison of nations. They had imprisoned all of these people. complete equality of rights for all nations, the right of nations to self-determination, the unity of the workers of all nations. This was the dream that Lenin aspired towards, that we're going to do away with all of this oppression, these horrible things, etc. In this situation, he continues, the proletariat of Russia is faced with a twofold, or rather a two-sided task. On the one hand, to combat nationalism of every kind, above all, sabse pehle, most importantly, great Russian nationalism. We have to combat this. To recognize not only fully equal rights for all the nations in general, but also equality of rights as regards polity, the right of nations to self-determination, to secession. In other words, they can even leave the country if they want to. They have a legal right. A constitutional method has to be devised that if they don't want to live with us, they don't. There should be no force used against them. And at the same time, it is their task in the interest of a successful struggle against all and every kind of nationalism amongst all nations to preserve the unity of the proletariat struggle and the proletarian organizations, amalgamating these organizations into a close-knit international association despite bourgeois strikings for national exclusiveness. In other words, you see the Marxist vision here of being against nationalism, of believing in the equality of all nations. जिस तरह वो John Lennon कहता है ना कि imagine there are no countries, etc. So they are also of the same view that nation, the idea of nationalism is a bourgeois construction, it's a capitalist construction. We don't believe in that. We want all humanity to be free. So the national self-determination, therefore, was always subservient to the proletariat cause. The proletariat cause was what drove their national policy. Their national policy was not an end in itself, but a means to bring people of different nationalities together in order to combat capitalism, imperialism, classes, etc., etc. And Lenin viewed, of course, the Russian proletariat as the vanguard now of the world struggle, because it was the proletariat that had managed successfully to capture state power. This was criticized by many Marxists in Europe, specifically the leader of the biggest Marxist party at that time, Karl Kautsky, which is the German Social Democratic Labour Party. That was the party that had been set up by Marx and Engels themselves. The leader of that party criticized the Bolsheviks and said, what are you doing? Why are you taking state power? You're in a very backward society. We are in an advanced society. We should take state power. If we haven't managed to take state power, you're taking state power. This is going to be a disaster, he said. But Lenin said, no, you are wrong. To wait until the working classes carry out a revolution on an international scale means that everyone will remain suspended in midair. हम बैठे रहें twiddling our thumbs till you make the revolution. ऐसे कैसे हो सकता है? We have to break the capitalist chain wherever it's weakest. We managed to break it, आप भी करें. The interesting thing about Marxism is that they did not think that Asia had the same historical pattern of development as Europe. Europe had gone through its own stages of historical development. The kind of beginnings, let's say, of European society is often traced to the Greek period. So they had the Greco-Roman period, Greece and Roman period. All of that was based on slavery, massive levels of plantation slavery. That was referred to by Karl Marx as ancient society. Then with the fall of Rome, over time, by the 9th century, from the 5th to the 9th century, develops a new system that is referred to as feudalism. The center of that feudalism is really France. That's really the apex of feudalism. And together with that develops the Catholic Church. And the church is also considered by Marxists to be one of the central institutions of feudalism. Around the 16th century, they write, the markets begin to develop, sea trade begins to develop, and from that the traders become stronger and stronger, and the traders transform now from just doing trade to also doing manufacturing. They become, in other words, capitalists. And so rises the capitalist system. And over about 200 years, the capitalist class now takes power, finally taking exclusive power in the American Revolution and then in the French Revolution. Okay? That's the first time that the capitalists emerge and have now exclusive power over the state. Otherwise, they have to share it. They have to lobby for their interests, etc. But for Karl Marx, the history of Asia was completely different. He did not think that you and I went through a stage of feudalism. Every book, every newspaper article we read talks about Pakistani feudalism, Indian feudalism, the feudals are doing this, the feudals are doing that. And one imagines that this is a Marxist point of view. No. Marx was of the point of view that India did not develop a feudal mode of production. Nor did they have Greco-Roman kind of slavery. China did not have that either. He did not think that the Muslim states had any of this either. He did not think that the whole African states across the Sahara, from Morocco all the way to the Mongolian steppes, Marx thought was a different formation, a different economic system. He didn't really spend a lot of time looking into the system, so he just very briefly called it the Asiatic mode of production. Gave it a rough sort of title, didn't go into too much detail. He thought others will continue this research. For me, for now, I'm content to say that this is a different system. What were the features of this Asiatic mode of production? The key thing about this system was that this is a region of the world, if you ever look at the map, which is very, very arid. There's little rainfall. Or if the rainfall comes, it all comes in 15 days during the monsoon. For that reason, in this entire geographical region, people who wanted to move to agriculture had to create artificial means of irrigation. They had to dig canals. They had to create barrages. They had to save water. They had to save the water of the Nile which flooded. They had to find a way in which to use that water, because rainwater is not going to do it for you as far as agriculture is concerned. It's insufficient, or it's too much in too little time. It's not spread out enough for you to do agriculture. So you need artificial irrigation. This is why the whole system of Asia was very, very different. In fact, that's what I wrote about in my PhD thesis, which was published as a book, The Class Structure of Pakistan, by Oxford University Press. Please do go and buy it if you like. So the characteristic of this mode of production, this economic system, was isolated peasant communities, village community. The village system, he says, in India is a system which has, you have one village with the same class structure, the same caste system, and this village has almost no connection with the next village, which has no connection with the next one, which has no connection with the next one, which has no connection. There are no roads between villages. They're just living on their own. They are self-sufficient completely. रियासत में क्या हो रहा है, जंग हो रही है, क्या हो रहा है, उनको परवाह कोई नहीं. ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਪਿੰਡ 'ਚ ਖੁਸ਼ ਹਾਂ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਜੀ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਮੁਗਲ ਆਉਂਦੇ ਨੇ ਜਾਂ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਨੇ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਕੀ ਫਰਕ ਪੈਂਦਾ. That is how Marx characterizes the peasantry of India. He says they were totally in their own world, with the exception only, of course, of the fact that they had to pay a tribute to the Jagirdar through the Zamindar. The Zamindar was also not a private property owner in the Mughal system or earlier. He was basically in charge of collecting the taxes. This is the Mughal system we're talking about. The equivalent system in the Abbasid period, Umayyad period for the Islamic period was the land, what we call a zamindar over here, was called a dehkan over there. जिस खेत से दहकां को मयसर ना हो रोज़ी, उस खेत के हर खोशाए गंदम को जला दो, ये अलामा इकबाल का मशहूर शेर है. Dehkan was the tax collector, not the lowest of the low. And above the Dehkan was the Jagirdar, the Mansabdar, the Fauji commander, not an agriculturalist, a military commander. The Muslims, when they broke up, when they gave responsibility of these states to different warlords and commanders and generals and whatnot, governors, etc., they used to call it Iqta. Iqta just means to cut something. जैसे आप कहते हैं कि कता कलामी माफ. It means to cut something. So I'm just going to cut this portion and I'm going to give it to you that you can collect the taxes from here. And then I'm not going to pay you anything because you're collecting from there. तो आपका काम पूरा हो रहा है. ठीक है? So this is also called iqtadari system. One of the key functions of the state in this system was irrigation. They had to make sure that the water gets there. And for that very reason, private property was an impossibility. Think about it. If the river is over here, and I dig a canal, and the first person gets water from it, and the second person, and the third person, the fourth person, the digging of that canal requires the collective labor of every land and everybody down that canal, without which the agriculture is not going to work. So the claim to private property cannot exist because that land has only become zarkhez, it has only become possible for you to cultivate it through the collective work of everybody from the river to the field. You see that? So for that reason, Iraq mein jo agriculture tha, wo private property nahi tha. You can read about that in Islamic history as well, when Hazrat Umar takes over, Radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, how he manages that entire situation, scenario, etc. We won't go into that. But the point is, for Marx, this was a very different system. Lenin began to write that the old colonial system, which the British had created, the French had created, had become even more horrible than it was in the past. In the past, the colonial system was a system in which the British, the French, and others went to these faraway places in order to sell their things, their commodities. They were basically traders. Like you've heard that the British East India Company came to Jahangir to trade. But now, by the late 19th century, whole transformation had occurred, industrialization, so many other things, the creation of banks, the creation of these big mega states, all of these things have transformed. And Lenin says capitalism has changed from just mere colonialism into a worse system, which he calls imperialism. Let me also say, what is colony? What is a colony? What is colonialism? The word colony literally comes from Latin and Roman, and it actually means a peasant, somebody who farms, an agriculturalist. So colonies were basically agricultural colonies that the Romans created. So the whole purpose of the colonial system was to go to these other places and settle there and then to do agriculture there, like happened in the United States of America, like what happened in Australia, and sadly, like what happened also in Israel. So to the number of old motives of colonial policy, finance, capital had added the struggle of the sources of raw material for the export of capital for spheres of influence, i.e. for spheres of profitable deals, concessions, monopoly profits, and so on, economic territory in general. When the colonies of European powers, for instance, comprised only 1/10 of the territory of Africa, as was the case in 1876, colonial policy was able to develop by methods other than those of monopoly, by the free grabbing of territory, so to speak. But when 9/10 of Africa had been seized by 1900, then the whole world had been divided up. There was inevitably ushered in the era of monopoly possession of colonies, and consequently of particularly intense struggle for the division and redivision of the world. So the colonial system had become an imperial system. What's the difference? Now they're just not interested in selling things, etc. They're interested in monopolizing the resources, the land, the raw materials, the markets, everything. And moreover, since they have been occupying all this land, there's no new land to occupy. The only way they can extend their empire is to fight another empire. And that's why World War I happens. All the empires basically are fighting each other for the third world, for bigger colonies. So this, of course, gives rise to national liberation struggles. People of the third world want to be free. And for this purpose, the communists created what they call the Comintern, which is the Communist International. Put it together, you get the Comintern. The Comintern was to be the vehicle through which the communists would help the rebellion of the third world against these colonial and imperial powers. By the early 1920s, communist parties had been set up by the Comintern in major third world countries. They had been set up in China, they had been set up in India, in Indonesia, in Turkey, in Iran. All of them saw the establishment quickly of communist parties, very rapidly. And that's thanks to the Comintern. Communists themselves, who were inspired by Marx and the Bolshevik Revolution, and there are many people inspired by it, including Allama Iqbal, who writes Lenin Khuda Gaya Dur mein. But they had their own ideas, the communists of the third world. M.N. Roy, for example, thought that India was ripe and ready for a socialist revolution. Lenin was saying, hole chalo, hole chalo. Pehle zara national liberation struggle kar lo, British ko piche kar lo, phir baad mein socialism bula aane la. Nahi, abhi socialism. We said, okay, we'll include this in the draft thesis on the national and colonial question. Both things will. Mera thesis bhi dal dete hain, aapka bhi dal dete hain. Naraz no. There were others who thought, like communist Mir Said Sultan Galev, who thought all colonized Muslim people are proletarian peoples. मुसलमान तो है ही proletarian, सारे का सारा. हमारे अंदर कोई तबकाती इख्तलाफ है ही नहीं. Without strong class contradictions, and that the liberation of the colonies was an essential precondition for revolution in the West, etc. In China, the communists formed an alliance with the Comintern, which was the nationalist party, the party of Sun Yat-sen. In India, the communists began to agitate against the British. They were a very small party. They began to agitate against the British. The British very quickly suppressed them, had various conspiracy cases against them. Not the Rawalpindi conspiracy case, but the Kanpur conspiracy case and other Meerut conspiracy case and so on. Meanwhile, the Comintern continued to call intellectuals from the third world to Moscow, to this modern-looking university, which didn't look like this at that time. This was at that time called the Sun Yat-sen University. Sun Yat-sen was the great leader of the Chinese nationalist movement. And although he was not a Marxist, but the Marxists thought that he was fighting to liberate China from colonial powers. We will support him. Now it's not called the Sun Yat-sen University, it's called the Russian People's Friendship University, and you can see this is not obviously the building that was created back then. This is a new and modern building. Sadly, the Chinese Revolution now was crushed by the nationalists in the Shanghai Massacre in 1927. It's a huge massacre, terrible massacre. In fact, because the communists used to wear a red scarf to identify themselves, communists could be identified by the fact that the dye of the scarf would stay on their gala. So they would say, oh, your gala is red. Let's make it a little more red. Off with your head. It's a horrible massacre. So the people who did the massacre were their own allies, the Comintern itself, the Nationalist Party. This was a huge, huge setback for the communist movement. And similarly, CPI was completely banned in 1934 and went underground, and it had like 1,000, 1,200 members, nothing substantial at all. Very small party now. Stalin takes power in the Soviet Union and looks at the situation, especially after 1927, and sees that, number one, the revolution in the third world is not going so well. And on the other hand, the fascists are taking power and the Nazis are taking power in Europe. And they are not pulling their punches. They make it very clear that they are going to crush the communists. They're going to destroy them. And they've already destroyed the communists in Spain, where Franco has taken power, was allied with the fascists, etc. So Stalin says, we have to industrialize in 10 years. We have to do in 10 years what Europe did in 100 years. How is that even possible? He says, well, first, we have to collectivize the agriculture. Why? Because now, in the Bolshevik Revolution, the big feudal estates had been broken up and given to peasants. But not everybody got it. The rich peasants got rich, and the poor peasants still were landless. So there were still classes in the Soviet Union. The rich peasants were known in Russian as kulaks. And the rich peasants had said, increase the price for our produce and give us more money, because they were selling to the state. Bukharin actually said, yes, let's do that. But Stalin and his followers said, if we increase the price for it, we will not have any resources from which we will be able to industrialize and match the power of the West, which is getting ready for war with us. They've already been to war in World War I. Millions have died. They have also seen the Civil War, which was a situation where about 14 countries invaded the Soviet Union to destroy the Bolshevik Revolution. About 10 million people died in that war, so absolutely horrific. So a famine started in that period because of that horrible war. So they're like, we have to get ready. There's just nothing else we can do. So they said, collectivize it. Go into the countryside, arouse the poor, and take over the land of the rich and make it into collective farms. You can imagine that this caused a major, major clash. It was going to, because the kulaks are not like the feudal lords. Feudal lords are aate mein namak ke barabar hai. But kulaks is a big class of people. It's a lot of people, millions of people. So this is going to be a very big confrontation. And that's what happens. Big confrontation, violence, etc. But collectivization occurs, and Stalin gets the resources now for industrialization. And he goes into forced industrialization. He's like, we are going to do a force march. We are just going to industrialize so fast that jiski hadis aap koi nahi. We're not going to listen to any opposition whatsoever to this. So they create a whole economic plan. It's one of the first big plans to be created. And they're like, this is what we have to do, and we're going to do it, and we're not going to take any opposition. And of course, then as a result, there are purges, there are trials, there are executions, there is all sorts of conspiracy theories, wo Nazi hai, wo fascist hai, wo falana hai, and so on, and big purges, big trials, big executions, big violence. But it is successful. They managed to industrialize very, very fast. And they needed to industrialize very fast because look at this map. You see the dark gray areas are where the Nazis take power directly, and the light gray areas are where their allies take power. All the gray areas are where the fascists and Nazis are in power. And so the Soviet Union over here in red is fighting all of these countries. That's pretty much all of Europe, with the exception only of United Kingdom. They're pretty much fighting. They're not just fighting the Germans. They're not just fighting the Austro-Hungarians. They're fighting everybody. And they fight them. And they win at a huge cost. 26 million lives lost in Russia alone. Overall, across the world, 50 million lives. The worst war the world has ever seen. A huge number of people in China. China, the war was so horrific, you cannot even begin to imagine. What the Japanese did in China, absolutely horrible. So this is a horrible war. After the war, the Soviet Union makes an alliance with the leader of the Communist Party of China, who has won in 1949 against the Comintern and is now in power. That's Mao Zedong. And Khrushchev, who comes after Stalin, decides that we are going to invest in China in a big way. We're going to bring it up, and that will show to the people of the Third World that the Soviet Union is their friend and will help them against colonialism. So Moscow agrees under Khrushchev to increase aid to China 7-fold in 2 years. They're already getting aid from the time of Stalin, but now they get even more aid. And the total cost of the program up to 1960 was about 20 billion rubles in export prices, something which the historian Sergei Gancharenko estimates as equaling 7% of Soviet national income for the period. They gave 7% of their income to China to help them grow. Oh my God, 7% is huge. Massive investment, huge investment. And Soviet Union itself has just barely come out of war where it's completely devastated and destroyed. So this is a pretty big sacrifice. But relations between them don't go so well. In fact, Mao said we need more, faster, better, and cheaper socialism. He designed the Great Leap Forward in 1958. He said we're going to do this a different way. We're not going to follow the Soviet model because the Soviet model relied on taking surplus from the peasantry and creating industry with that. But the whole Chinese revolution is based on the peasantry. We can't take surplus from them. We have to find a way to start the industrialization from the rural areas without taking surplus from the peasantry. That's the main idea behind the Great Leap Forward. But it doesn't work. By the summer of 1960, Khrushchev reacts by suddenly withdrawing all aid and all technical advisors. He says we're not going to give aid to China anymore because China has been criticizing them just under the table in a very indirect way. Like they criticize Tito, but actually you can read between the lines and understand the criticisms of the Soviet Union. So now Mao openly accuses Khrushchev of betraying socialism. He says these people have betrayed socialism. In fact, the situation becomes so bad, they're writing against each other all the time, that in 1969 they even have a short border skirmish. They even have a war. And now the Chinese say the Soviet Union is not a socialist country, it's an imperialist country. And it's what they call social imperialism. Socialism in words, imperialism in deeds. This is the Sino-Soviet split that splits the communist movement all over the world. Every country in the world, there's a split between pro-Chinese and pro-Soviet communists. Soviet Union itself decides, okay, we will help Nehru, we will give money to India, we will help them, we will help Nasser in Egypt, and if China doesn't want to play ball, that's fine. Khrushchev begins two big initiatives. One is the Virgin Land Scheme, where he basically decides that he's going to bring 32 million acres of land under cultivation in Kazakhstan. It's a huge scheme, but it also has negative environmental consequences. The other is the space race. The Soviet Union manages to send the first satellite into space, the Sputnik. They send the first satellite into space, then they send the first animal into space, then they get the first photographs of the dark side of the moon, Pink Floyd album, they go to the other side of the moon. Then they send the first person into space, that's Yuri Gagarin. They send the first woman into space. They do the first spacewalk. They do the first aircraft landing on the moon. And then by this time, the United States of America, Kennedy says, we've got to get a man on the moon before the Soviet Union, otherwise we'll lose the space race. They get Neil Armstrong to the moon, etc. By the way, the launching of the Sputnik has a huge impact on the US. And the whole space race has a huge positive impact on the US. The US is like, the Soviet Union is leaving us behind. We have to do something. And so they start investing in science in a huge way. Anyway, after that, they send a spacecraft. They spend a spacecraft landing on another planet, that is Venus. They create the first space station. They create the first landing on Mars, etc., and so on, etc., etc. The internet and your cell phones and all this new technology was created as a consequence of this race between the Soviet Union and America over space. Of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the space race also collapsed. And it went to whom? Mr. Elon Musk, sadly. So finally, and this is the end, the Soviet elite at that time in the 60s, as we go into the Cold War, which escalates by the 1970s, believed firmly that socialism would replace capitalism within one generation. And Khrushchev says in 61, history proves that until socialism triumphed in at least a part of the world, there could be no question of destroying colonialism. The Soviet Union's role, as they saw it, was to end colonial empires. The whole course is about how this rivalry shaped the Third World. That was my introduction to this course.